we can talk about Dawn of the Planet of the Apes, I feel obliged to give you a sort of historical rundown of the entire Apes franchise. Dawn's success is due at least in some part to the successes and failures of its predecessors, and glossing over almost 50 years worth of sequels and remakes just doesn't really seem in the spirit of this show. So let's get to it. In 1968, 20th Century Fox funded an adaptation of Frenchman Pierre Boyer's novel, Planet of the Apes. His work was a pretty safe bet for them, considering they just won 7 Oscars for adapting his other famous work, Bridge on the River Kwai. I've always loved the original Planet of the Apes. I remember my mom checking out the tape from the library, way back when. I was 10 or something, and I was just floored. It was tension-inducing, it had awesome dialogue, and a twist to end all twists. I felt so grown up watching it, and years later it still astounds me. This is something I largely credit to the ridiculous amount of talent the writers had. Twilight Zone icon Rod Serling, who, little known fact, actually wrote over half the episodes of that show, managed to hit this film out of the park with help from his 2-time Oscar-winning collaborator Michael Wilson. On the surface, Planet of the Apes is a gripping sci-fi mystery that manages to both parallel and deviate from our own society, with tons of iconic moments and imagery. But peel back the layers, and you begin to see that Planet of the Apes is also a parable for tons of the developing issues in the late 1960s. The study of psychological behaviorism, the idea of religious radicals limiting the pursuit of knowledge, and the ever-looming concept that nuclear war would doom us all. You can attack this movie from so many different angles, but ultimately, I see it as an amazing study of what it means to be human, our weaknesses, our triumphs, how we handle fear and power. And it's just so smart. It's one of the smartest movies I've ever seen, and I highly encourage you to pop over to your local library and check it out if you haven't seen it. After the success of the original, 20th Century Fox began losing a crap ton of money in the late 60s and early 70s. Slashing the budget with each new installment, they released a sequel to Planet of the Apes almost every year. To great success, I might add, as Beneath, Escape, Conquest, and Battle all opened to number 1 at the box office. As far as the content of these films, they range from interesting but poorly executed to very interesting and executed a little bit better. I don't love any of them as much as I love the original, but as far as sequels go, they really knock it out of the park. Every film is totally original and expands on the already very complex world set up in the first. They each tackle different movements and themes and characters, and they do so with the same amount of passion and flair that the original film had. I really like them a lot, especially Escape, because it has a totally awesome Apes shopping montage, but for time's sake, let's move on. After a successful TV run, Fox decided to reboot the franchise for another theatrical release in the mid-1980s, and subsequently they went through development hell. It took another 21 years before they found someone else to helm the franchise. Tim Burton, and even he couldn't get Fox to work with him on a feasible budget. I haven't seen all of the Burton remake because I wasn't chained in a dungeon somewhere being forced to watch the Burton remake, but I will say this. I've never met a person who liked this movie. I doubt Burton likes this movie because he said he'd rather jump out a window than make a second installment, and every time it comes on FX, my mom gets pissed off and changes the channel. Oh, also, there's an Ape Lincoln statue. Yeah, that exists. Anyway, Fox went back to the franchise 10 years later with 2011's Rise of the Planet of the Apes, and unlike the Burton film, it was a super smart reintroduction to the franchise. While not nearly as layered as the 1968 original, Rise still creates something smart but action-packed, and it's got drama and really engaging characters, and John Lithgow and the possibility for a Mars movie, including defined conflict and biting off fingers. Ugh! I love this movie. A lot of times when it comes to science fiction, we're placed in an unfamiliar world and then endeared to it by the likable characters and situation. But every now and again, we're given this completely different kind of structure, one that starts from our world first and then pushes into the unfamiliar. Movies like Rise, Interstellar, and Arrival do that to wondrous success. It's harder because you have to convince an audience that all your sci-fi bullcrap can be a possibility in real life. But Rise somehow makes talking chimpanzees feasible. It begins with all these really familiar problems. Poaching, disease, corporate greed, etc. and then from there it's a slow burn into something more spectacular. I don't feel cheated or think, oh, come on, or any of that when Caesar starts talking. I was just like, yes, 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 all of this. And because Rise pulls off that transition between reality and dystopia so well, it makes Dawn a billion times more satisfying. And it's obvious that the director Rupert Wyatt and the husband and wife writing/producing team of Rick Jaffa and Amanda Silver not only had a love for Rise, but for those original 1970s films that I loved. I mean, they reference them to the point where it sort of becomes distracting.
It's a madhouse! A madhouse!
It's a madhouse! It's a madhouse!
Take your stinking paws off me, you damn dirty ape!
Take your stinking paw off me, you damn dirty ape!
No! No!
But outside of quotes, there's something about this movie that just screams old school sci-fi to me. I can't really put my finger on it. Just look at this scene where the apes are taking over the lab. Doesn't it remind you a little bit of the birds? Just a little bit. And when the apes are taking over San Francisco, doesn't it seem a little like Godzilla, but with no giant lizard? I don't know if these were intentional nods or not, but the whole movie just has this sort of classic Hollywood flair to it that I really love.
Baby, you're so classic!
But moving on, let's talk about why I decided to make this video in the first place. Dawn of the Planet of the Apes was released in July of 2014, and I think it's an overlooked masterpiece. Its summer release date and flashy special effects seem to scream happy explosion times action film. And while it is sort of that, the truth is Dawn offers so much more than popcorn fodder. It's the only Apes film that I think even holds a candle to the original, and it's got a little something for everybody. I could talk about this movie for hours, but here are just 5 quick reasons why Dawn rocks my socks.
7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
This movie fixes one of my main problems with Rise, in that it's very open about its relationships to other films without hitting you over the head with quotes that don't really mean anything besides, ooh, callback, they said the thing, it's the get my hands off thing, hey, ho. Ugh. The Apes Must Not Kill mantra, for example, is from Battle of the Planet of the Apes, but it's subtle and meaningful in its own right, and they don't just, take it as a direct quote, it's used as a plot device. And that doesn't just stop with references to the other Apes films. The music from 2001: A Space Odyssey can be heard during the hunting sequence of this movie, and it fits the scene so well. It harkens you to the idea of evolution and how these characters are growing and how they're so different from the last movie, and it just sets everything up perfectly. But I think my favorite example of how this movie uses references is how the midpoint is just lifted straight out of Julius Caesar. If you've never read it or seen it, the play has less to do with its titular character and focuses mainly on the traitors Brutus and Cassius. Cassius is the brains of the operation. He hates how cherished Caesar is to the people of Rome, and convinces Brutus that Caesar's gonna end up a tyrant if he doesn't die soon. So, even though Brutus loves Caesar as a person, he kills his friend. For the safety of Rome, for his countrymen, because he doesn't want to see a poor leader in power. Just like Koba kills his Caesar because he wants the ape colony to go to war with humans. It has to happen in order for them to survive. As the film progresses, however, we realize that Koba uses a love for his fellow ape as a guise in order to get more power. He's not really Brutus, he's Cassius. Slightly copying one of the most famous plays of all time is a pretty ballsy move, but I think Dawn gets away with it because it's changed just enough. It doesn't consume the rest of the plot. Shakespeare gets a nod, an appreciation. It's something that influences the film, but nobody has to pull out a book and be like, "Et tu, Koba?" for us to get that. This movie treats us like we're smart, and I really appreciate that in an era where basically everything is spelled out for us constantly. I also love the way Dawn handles the concept of hate. Koba's genocidal tendencies are bad, but they're not out of nowhere, and they're not cartoonish. They're brought forth by pain and insecurity and fear. The same thing goes for Dreyfus. He's not a bad person, he just makes poor choices. He could still change his behavior, he could still be like Malcolm, but he's just so consumed with the other aspects of his life that he can't trust anyone. His familial loss, his people's death, the looming unknown threat on top of the tower, just drives him to die, to try and take down something he doesn't understand. If these antagonists just followed the words of the Vlogbrothers and imagined people complexly, maybe there'd be a happy-go-lucky sunrise jaunt through some flowers at the end of this film. But instead we get a promise of more death, a war brought on by our own ineptitude to forgive and hear out opposition, a war brought on by hate that we can rationalize but can never justify. It's sad, but it's unique and great, and I really love that. Another one of my favorite aspects of this movie is the plot. There is so much going on that you don't even realize what the main conflict is until it's dropped on you like a sack of bricks 20 minutes in. I mean, first you're introduced to a father and son conflict between a now much older and wiser Caesar and his impulsive son Blue Eyes. But before you can even process this father-son stuff, we're interrupted by a freaking bear. A bear that not only introduces the major conflict of survival, but gets us to sympathize with our future antagonist. But there's no time to focus on this relationship because we have to go to the awesome ape village and get awesome world building, and oh wait, kaboom! Now we have ape versus human conflict. A conflict that totally throws the audience through a loop because, you know, we're human, and we kind of want to be on our own side, but we don't have time to process how the humans interact with apes because humans have to do their human thing and freak the heck out because there's freaking talking apes, and what do we even do, and everybody has a different idea, and we're gonna infight, and oh my gosh, it's just great. This movie's great! And only after all of this do we finally get into the real main conflict between protagonist and antagonist. Caesar versus Koba. And man, that is just rad. That's great writing. Something else I want to bring up about this movie is how the ensemble cast works just fluidly. Everyone overlaps and everyone matters. And most of them were not introduced in the last film, but Caesar, Koba, Blue Eyes, Cornelia, Malcolm, Dreyfus, Ellie, Alexander, Carver, and Maurice, they all matter. And by the end of this film, you have a clear understanding of why they did what they did. And that's so hard to do. It's dually amazing when you realize that the whole ensemble locks together in this mosaic of parallels and foils. I could literally pull any character from this film and give you a play-by-play on how they interlock with the others. Just let me use Blue Eyes as an example because he's probably my favorite. Blue Eyes almost directly parallels Alexander in that he is also the teenage son of a powerful leader in a small colony. But Alexander and Blue Eyes are juxtaposed in that Alexander is about to gain a mother in Ellie, and Blue Eyes is about to lose his mother to illness. This parallel foil thing can also be seen in how Caesar grew up versus how Blue Eyes grew up. Caesar had a shift in ideology away from his figurative father after being removed from his human-centric world in Rise. In Dawn, we see Blue Eyes have a shift in ideology away from his literal father after being removed from his ape-centric world and interacting with humans for the first time. Speaking of ideological shifts, the Blue Eyes-Koba relationship is also super interesting, as both share the same worldview towards the beginning of the film because they've only seen the violence of humans. Blue Eyes has only ever seen them basically shoot his friend on sight. He's never even seen a human. That was his first interaction with a human, was a gunshot. But by the end of the film, Blue Eyes is a foil to Koba's beliefs. He's young and loyal to his father and recognizes that the actions of a powerful few should not be used to demonize an entire culture. But Dawn's greatest success is how it handles tone, and in my opinion, it's also what makes this movie a great sequel and remake. The feeling of your world does so much for an audience, and changing it for a new story will just totally screw you most of the time. A tonal shift has to make sense for the characters, make sense for the world building, and it has to be a tone worth changing. Only a few movies pull it off. And oftentimes I feel that there's more benefit to sticking with your guns and capitalizing on what made your source material great in the first place. And that's what Dawn does. It takes everything from Rise and everything from the 70s films and establishes a very different plot with a familiar tone. To give you an example of how shifting tones can just totally derail a franchise, look at Pirates of the Caribbean. The first Pirates, Curse of the Black Pearl, establishes so many, physical dynamics. The pirates' rock star attitudes, supernatural goobity-gook, and the clashing ideals between law and lawbreakers. But what's behind all of those things is this sort of adventure-y fun tone that punctuates every scene. And it's the tone that sold me on Pirates. Jack Sparrow's wry smile, Will Turner's quirky yow, whatever, yar. It was fun, it was cool. But the sequel changed that up to something way more serious and dramatic, and we haven't really gotten that plucky adventure again. Yes, we get the functionality of drunk pirates and supernatural junk, but it's not the same feeling behind those dynamics. And while I still like the second Pirates as a movie, I don't really love it as a sequel. The shift from adventure to drama just works against it. Back to Dawn. Even though it's set in a totally different world from Rise, you still see the functionality that was established in the first movie. You see that sort of tribal separation between mankind and the apes. You see the negative effects of acting without boundaries. You see the duality of human nature, and those are the sort of drunken pirateness of a Planet of the Apes film. But you don't just get the drunken pirateness, you don't just get simple functionality, you get the tension of an Apes movie. A tone that extends all the way back to 1968. You get the drama, you get the action, it's all there. And it reminds you of those good times you had with those original films, and still manages to stand wholly on its own merit and elevate the franchise to new heights, because there's new problems and character dynamics and worlds to find. That's not easy. That's basically impossible. To nail a feeling, to nail an air about something, an almost indefinable trait that makes something unique, while simultaneously not being super derivative of that uniqueness. This movie is incredible and admirable and just great filmmaking, and that's why I think it works so well as a sequel and remake, and that's why I can't wait for more.
Okay.
Thank you so much for watching. If you thought that was cool, I plan to upload every month on the 22nd, so there'll be more to come. Don't worry. You can also follow me on Twitter at IsaacLastname if you are into that. If you're a Twittery guy or girl or whatever. Yeah. I leave you with a clip of Andy Serkis talking to himself as both Caesar and Gollum. Bye, y'all.
God, you know what? Caesar, I'm on Conan.